The morning began with the sound of boots slapping against frozen earth. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but the cold already bit through thin fabric like knives. In a fenced compound somewhere in western Germany, the air stank of wet straw and diesel smoke. Dozens of German women, most barely out of their 20s, stood shoulder to shoulder, trembling. Their breath rose like ghosts in the mist. They had been captured 3 days earlier, stripped of rank, and marched here with only the dresses they wore. A guard barked something in English. None of the women moved. He shouted again, louder this time, and pointed at one of them, a blonde woman clutching her torn blue dress. She stepped forward, hesitant. The guard yanked the fabric from her hands and, with a cruel smirk, threw it into the mud. The camp went silent. The slap of wet cloth landing on frozen ground sounded louder than the wind. Someone laughed. Another guard kicked over a bucket of water. The icy splash hit their bare legs. "Orders are orders," one of them muttered. For the prisoners, humiliation had replaced hunger as the sharper pain. They had only one dress each. No coats, no spare clothes, no dignity left to barter with. By that winter of 1945, over 400,000 Axis prisoners were scattered across Allied camps. Most were men. A few thousand were women, nurses, auxiliaries, or those simply caught in retreat. To the guards, they were an afterthought. To each other, they were the only witnesses left. The mud thickened around their ankles as the blonde woman bent to pick up her dress. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from shame. Before she could touch it, a different pair of boots stopped beside her. A woman's voice, firm but calm, cut through the jeers. "That's enough." The guards froze. An American nurse stepped forward, her uniform crisp against the gray dawn. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked, long, steady, and disapproving. The kind of look that silenced soldiers faster than any rank. The prisoners watched as she knelt, lifted the muddy fabric herself, and handed it back. No words, just an order through silence. Tomorrow, that same nurse would do something none of them expected. Something that would shift the entire camp's balance of power. The same cold wind cut across the barbed wire fences the next morning, carrying with it the faint hum of distant engines and the smell of burnt coffee from the guards' mess. The women stood in line again, heads lowered, eyes hollow. But this time, the American nurse from yesterday was already there, standing beside the guards. Her name, stitched faintly on her uniform, read Latan Daniels. She didn't shout, didn't smile. She simply observed. When one of the guards reached for the same blonde woman, perhaps looking to finish yesterday's cruel entertainment, Daniels raised a hand. "Step back," she said. Her tone was quiet but final. The men hesitated, uncertain if defying a medic ranked beneath them was worth it. She gave no speech, no sermon. Instead, she motioned to a supply truck nearby and ordered 2 folded blankets to be brought out. The women didn't dare hope it was for them until she walked straight to their line and placed one on each pair of shivering shoulders. No words were exchanged, but the silence that followed was heavier than any command. The guards looked away first. The women stood frozen, unsure whether this mercy was real or a trick. By that winter of 1945, the Geneva Convention, signed back in 1929, technically guaranteed humane treatment for all prisoners. But on the ground, reality depended entirely on who enforced it. Reports from that period mention entire divisions where female POWs received nothing but old canvas tents and half rations. In that context, one officer's quiet defiance was more radical than open rebellion. The nurse lingered for a moment, her breath misting in the cold. Her eyes weren't soft. They were tired, almost haunted. One of the prisoners, in her broken English, whispered later, "She looked at us like she hated war itself, not us." That small act cracked something invisible. The women began to see the guards differently, not as a wall of cruelty, but a mix of faces, some human, some indifferent. Inside the barracks, whispers spread. The nurse, who stopped the humiliation. That night, the women wrapped the coarse blankets tight around themselves. For the first time, sleep came without tears. But mercy changes more than just warmth. It shifts power. And soon, that shift would ripple through the camp's rigid silence. Days blurred into each other like smudged ink on damp paper. Inside the women's compound, time didn't move. It just repeated. Every dawn began the same. A whistle, a roll call, and the slow shuffle of boots over frozen mud. No one used names anymore. Each woman had a number, scratched onto a metal tag that hung from her neck like a weight. The nurse, Lieutenant Daniels, still made her rounds, wordless and efficient. The guards had stopped their taunts, not out of guilt, but because the camp itself had gone quiet. Even laughter had become suspicious. The prisoners learned that silence was safer than speech, obedience safer than dignity. Inside the barracks, the air reeked of disinfectant and mildew. Wooden bunks creaked under the weight of exhaustion. Bread arrived once a day, thin and dry. Soup came twice a week, watery and cold. Reports from the time indicate that daily rations rarely reached 1,500 calories, barely enough to keep a body standing. 30% of the women showed signs of malnutrition. They learned to move slowly, to conserve energy, to survive invisibly. Outside, winter deepened. The guards lit fires near the fence to keep warm. The women huddled near cracks in the walls, trying to catch drifting heat. One prisoner kept a small pebble in her pocket, rubbing it for comfort. Another whispered fragments of hymns at night, voice barely audible under the wind's howl. There was no violence now, just routine. An endless choreography of endurance. Daniels still walked among them, handing out ointment or checking wounds. She never smiled, never lingered, but her presence reminded them that the world beyond the wire might still hold some shape of decency. One morning, however, the routine broke. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life, an unfamiliar voice, male, urgent. "New assignment for the women's section," it said. "Report to the East Yard immediately." Confused, the prisoners lined up. They were herded past the barracks, through mud and frost, until they reached a large open area where piles of uniforms were stacked beside rusted basins. A guard gestured with his rifle. "Laundry duty," he said flatly. The women stared at the heaps of American uniforms, stained, bloody, and frozen stiff. Their silence cracked for the first time, not in protest, but in disbelief. Tomorrow, their hands would bleed on foreign cloth. The frost that morning cut sharper than razors. Buckets clanged, water sloshed, and steam hissed from metal basins as it met the freezing air. The women stood in a ragged line before the piles of uniforms, American khaki stained dark with mud, and, in some places, dried blood. They had been given wooden brushes, chunks of harsh soap, and orders. Clean them until they pass inspection. A young prisoner named Lotta dipped her hands into the first bucket. The shock of the icy water made her gasp. Around her, dozens of women bent over the basins, scrubbing in silence. The sound was relentless. Scrape, rinse, wring, repeat. Within an hour, their fingers had turned purple. Within 2, they were bleeding. Each uniform was heavy with history. Some still had the scent of gunpowder clinging to the fabric. Others the faint trace of sweat and tobacco. The women worked without comment, though one finally whispered, "These clothes have warmth." "Ours had only mud," no one replied. But the thought lingered like smoke. Reports from winter 1945 described temperatures in Western Germany dipping well below freezing. POW compounds had no heated water. Washing became torture disguised as labor. The irony was brutal. The defeated forced to cleanse the victor's wounds through cloth. Hours stretched. The guards barely watched now. There was no rebellion in laundry, only the dull rhythm of survival. Lotta's knuckles split open, red drops staining the gray soap suds. She didn't stop. Somewhere behind her, Lieutenant Daniels appeared again, arms crossed. She watched for a long moment, then silently signaled for a guard to bring something. A small tin of salve was placed near the basins. She said nothing, just nodded once. That single gesture rippled through the group. One woman straightened her back. Another wiped her tears and kept scrubbing. For the first time, their work carried something other than fear. It carried defiance. By dusk, the uniforms hung in neat rows, steam rising from them like ghosts leaving bodies. The guards inspected the line, expressionless. But something had changed. Something subtle in the way those prisoners stood, chins lifted despite the cold. Tomorrow, that change would not go unnoticed. The Americans had begun to see something they didn't expect. Discipline where they expected despair. By the next morning, the mood in the camp had shifted, though no one said it out loud. The women walked differently, slower but taller. Their backs no longer curved under orders. Even the guards noticed. When they passed the washing yard, they saw the uniforms lined in perfect symmetry, each crease pressed with soldier-like precision. It was silent defiance, folded and hung to dry. Lieutenant Daniels stood near the line of garments, her breath curling into the frigid air. One of the guards, Corporal Hayes, watched the women work again. The sight unsettled him. He had expected them to break after the laundry shift, not sharpen. He muttered under his breath, "They're tougher than we thought." Daniels didn't reply, but the corner of her mouth twitched. That evening, while she checked the infirmary stocks, Hayes quietly set aside a few bars of soap and a roll of bandages. Later, under the cover of darkness, he left them near the women's barracks door. No one saw him do it, but everyone knew who had. The gesture wasn't romantic, nor guilt-ridden. It was something simpler. Recognition. In official reports written that winter of 1945, American officers noted remarkable resilience among female detainees, particularly those assigned to manual labor. The numbers meant little, but the change in attitude spoke volumes. The guards had stopped calling them Fräuleins. They began addressing them as ladies. One prisoner, an older nurse named Marta, whispered to her bunkmate, "They pity us now." Her friend shook her head. "No, they respect us." The idea seemed impossible, but that was exactly what frightened the guards most. From her quarters, Daniels wrote a brief note in her log. "Resilience is contagious. The women keep their dignity through order." She didn't realize that same order would soon be tested when something darker spread through the camp. Something invisible, carried by water, sickness, and exhaustion. For now, though, the camp was quiet again, but no longer numb. The laundry lines fluttered like flags of stubborn pride in the cold wind. The guards kept their distance. Respect was a dangerous seed. It grew even in the soil of defeat. That night, the first cough echoed from the barracks. By morning, more would follow. Fever was coming. The coughs started quietly, one then another, muffled in the cold dawn. Within 2 days, the sound filled the barracks. Blankets shook as women shivered beneath them, their breaths turning to vapor. Fever swept through the compound faster than any order ever had. Dysentery, some said. Influenza, others guessed. Whatever it was, it broke bodies that had already endured too much. Lotta lay curled on the lower bunk, eyes half closed. Her hands, still raw from laundry work, clutched the edge of her blanket. Marta pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering prayers in German. Outside, the guards argued about containment. "Let it run its course," one muttered. "They'll tough it out." But by the third night, even the guards stopped pretending it was minor. Lieutenant Daniels arrived before dawn, lantern in hand. The sight inside the barracks stopped her cold. Rows of women shaking, their breaths shallow, eyes sunken. She called for help, shouting louder than she ever had. Medics rushed in, laying stretchers along the narrow aisles. For the first time, the camp's noise was not cruelty, it was urgency. Medical reports from that winter estimated that up to 15% of camp inmates fell seriously ill during those freezing months. Food shortages, poor sanitation, and exposure made recovery nearly impossible. Yet somehow, these women refused to collapse completely. Even in fever, they took turns caring for each other, sharing water, holding hands, whispering names so no one disappeared silently. Daniels worked without pause. She moved from cot to cot, wiping faces, adjusting blankets, whispering to her orderlies in clipped tones. When one patient began to convulse, she dropped to her knees, held her down, and shouted for morphine. The guard at the door flinched. He had never seen compassion look this fierce. That night, after nearly 20 hours on her feet, Daniels sat on a stool outside the infirmary tent. Her uniform was stained with sweat and mud. A young American private passed her a canteen. "Why do you care?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. "Because someone has to." Inside, the women stirred in fevered dreams. One of them, Lotta, opened her eyes just long enough to see the nurse's shadow fall across her face. "Even our enemies carry us to warmth," she whispered, before drifting back into sleep. But when Daniels later inspected the bunks, she noticed something strange, something hidden beneath the mattresses that didn't belong. Lieutenant Daniels crouched beside the lower bunk, her lantern beam catching something small, metal glinting beneath a heap of rags. She reached under and pulled out a bent sewing needle, a spool of thread wound from unraveled blanket fibers, and scraps of torn fabric. Not contraband exactly, but not regulation either. She said nothing, just slipped the needle into her pocket and stood. Later that night, when the camp quieted and the fevered groans faded to soft breathing, she returned the needle to where she'd found it. Whatever they were doing with it, she wouldn't stop them. The next morning, the secret revealed itself. The women sat cross-legged on the barrack floor, working quietly. They were stitching together scraps, sheets, burlap, anything they could find, turning the ruins of their bedding into something resembling dresses. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. Their old clothes were in tatters, and winter still had its grip on the camp. Lotta's fever had broken, but her body trembled as she sewed. Marta guided her hands. "Tight stitches," she murmured. "If we're to stand, we stand looking human." Thread by thread, the women were reclaiming the one thing war had stolen first: dignity. Reports from Allied supply archives confirm that by early 1946, material shortages were so severe that even guards reused uniforms, sometimes sewing patches from canvas tents. The prisoners' improvisation was an act of resourcefulness that defied despair itself. When Daniels passed by, she slowed. Her gaze moved over the makeshift dresses, uneven hems, rough stitches, but unmistakably feminine. The women paused, waiting for reprimand. Instead, the nurse gave a single nod and walked on. That gesture spread warmth faster than any blanket could. At night, they whispered plans to trade scraps, share thread, hide the sewing between inspections. A single borrowed needle passed from hand to hand like a relic of freedom. Marta later recalled, "It wasn't fashion, it was proof that we still existed." But good things never stayed hidden long inside wire fences. 2 days later, the morning whistle blew early. Boots thundered toward the barracks. The door burst open. Officers, clipboards, flashlights. The women froze mid-stitch. An inspection had begun. And this time, it wasn't routine. The barrack door slammed open like a gunshot. Floodlights poured through the doorway, slicing across the rows of bunks and half-finished dresses. The women froze, needles mid-air, cloth slipping from trembling hands. A harsh American voice barked, "Inspection! Nobody moves!" Boots stomped in, the officers flanked by armed guards. Their clipboards gleamed in the cold light. Lieutenant Daniels followed behind, slower, face unreadable. She hadn't ordered this. She could tell by the tension in the guards' stance. They were looking to make an example. The senior officer, Major Ellison, snatched one of the homemade dresses from a bunk. His jaw clenched. Unauthorized materials. Defiance of regulations. His voice cut like glass. No one answered. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, pale but upright. Lotta's fingers still clutched her thread, blood drying around her nails. Ellison's eyes narrowed. "Strip them," he said flatly. Daniels stepped forward instantly. "Sir, that's unnecessary." "Lieutenant," he snapped, "you're here for medical oversight, not command." The guards hesitated only a moment before obeying. The women didn't scream this time. They had no energy left for humiliation. They simply looked ahead as rough hands tore their makeshift dresses away. Pieces of fabric hit the floor like fallen flags. The cold air bit through bare skin, and yet not one of them lowered her gaze. One prisoner whispered, "They think they've broken us again." Marta, standing beside her, whispered back, "Let them think." The silence afterward was unbearable. Even the guards shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the women and their commanding officer. Daniels's fists tightened at her sides. She couldn't stop it, but she could remember every face that flinched, every uniform that looked away. Ellison finally turned, muttering, "Confiscate everything." He left without another word. The guards gathered the scraps and backed out, leaving the door hanging open to the cold. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Marta stepped forward and closed it quietly, sealing the silence back in. That night, the women sat awake in the dark, bare but unbroken. Humiliation had become a strange kind of armor. By dawn, they would face the guards again, but this time not as victims. Tomorrow morning, when the whistle blew, none of them would move. The whistle screamed across the compound at dawn, but not a single woman moved. Frost glittered on the barbed wire, the air sharp enough to sting lungs. Guards shouted, boots pounding toward the barracks. Still, the door stayed closed. Inside, the women stood shoulder to shoulder, barefoot on the wooden floor, arms folded over their thin underclothes. Their faces were pale but steady. Lieutenant Daniels reached the scene seconds before the officers. She already knew what was happening. Through the slats, she saw dozens of motionless figures, a wall of silent defiance. Major Ellison stormed up behind her. "What in hell are they doing?" Daniels didn't answer. She already knew the answer, too. A guard slammed his rifle butt against the door. "Roll call! Out! Now!" Nothing. Only the sound of wind threading through the fences. Inside, Marta raised her chin. "If they want us outside," she whispered, "they'll have to carry us." Lotta, her voice shaking, added, "Not until they give us clothes." It was madness, bravery, or both. But the line had been drawn. For 10 minutes, the standoff held. Then 15, then 30. The guards aimed rifles. No one flinched. Every soldier there had seen combat, but none had seen this kind of courage. Reports later described it as unprecedented coordinated defiance. No yelling, no rebellion, just unyielding stillness. Daniels stepped forward, heart pounding. "Sir," she said carefully to Ellison, "you'll have to drag them all." "Everyone!" The major's jaw worked as he studied the unmoving door. This wasn't discipline anymore. It was a standoff against humiliation itself. Finally he hissed, "Fine! Keep them in there! No breakfast until compliance." He turned and walked off, but everyone knew he'd lost. Because as the sun rose higher, the women still stood, frozen, hungry, defiant. Daniels slipped a tin of water through a cracked window. Lotta whispered, "We stand like soldiers again." By afternoon, the guards had stopped shouting. By nightfall, the whole camp had heard what the women had done. Even the men's section murmured about it, how the unarmed ones had held their ground against rifles. Inside, Marta's voice broke the silence. "Tomorrow, they'll decide whether to crush us or listen." And indeed, the next morning, the camp commander himself would arrive. the camp awoke under a sky the color of steel. Word spread fast. The commander was coming. Not a rumor this time, but the real man himself, Colonel Warren, the highest-ranking officer in that sector. The guards straightened their uniforms. Even Major Ellison's arrogance looked thinner in the cold. The women stayed inside, waiting. No one knew what would happen when authority met defiance. The heavy door creaked open. Daniels stood just behind the colonel as he stepped inside. His boots echoed on the floorboards, slow, deliberate. The women didn't bow their heads. They met his eyes, every single one of them. That was what struck him first. Not rebellion, but silence with spine. He glanced around at the half-naked figures, the thin blankets draped over shoulders. "Who's in charge here?" he asked. Marta took a step forward. "We only ask for clothes," she said simply. Her accent rough, her voice steady. The colonel studied her, then the others. Ellison cleared his throat. "Sir, they disobeyed direct—" "Quiet!" Warren cut him off. For several long seconds, nothing moved but breath. Then the colonel turned to Daniels. "Do we have Red Cross stock?" She nodded cautiously. "A few parcels, sir. Civilian clothing." He exhaled through his nose. "Issue them." The room froze. Ellison blinked. "Sir, that's an order," Warren snapped. "And from this moment, these prisoners will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will not repeat this circus." Daniels felt a weight lift from her chest. She motioned for a guard to fetch the parcels. Within minutes, crates appeared, stamped with the Red Cross, packed with folded gray dresses and undergarments. The women watched in disbelief as each item was handed out, one by one. By late afternoon, the barrack glowed faintly with movement again. Fabric rustling, quiet thanks whispered under breath. Reports show that during late 1945, the Red Cross shipped nearly 90,000 clothing parcels monthly to Allied POW camps. But here, in this frozen corner, those parcels meant something else entirely. Acknowledgement. As Marta slipped on her new dress, she whispered, "This gray cloth feels like forgiveness." Outside, snow began to fall again, but not everyone accepted the peace. One woman, standing apart, refused her parcel. Her eyes were fixed on the muddy ground outside, where something still lay buried. Tomorrow, she would dig it up. Night fell early that winter, swallowing the camp in gray silence. While most women huddled near their bunks, clutching the new Red Cross dresses like talismans, one figure slipped outside. Lotta moved quietly, the cold biting through her thin soles. The ground was still frozen, the mud hard as stone, but she knew exactly where to go. She stopped behind the laundry yard, the same patch of dirt where, weeks earlier, her only dress had been thrown into the mud. The place looked different now, cleaner, emptier, but when she knelt and began to dig, the earth remembered. Her nails cracked against frozen clumps until her fingers found fabric, stiff, crusted, still faintly blue beneath layers of dirt. She pulled it free, trembling. It was ruined, of course. Torn seams, stains that no washing could erase. But as she held it up to the weak moonlight, something inside her broke and rebuilt at once. This wasn't just cloth anymore. It was everything that had happened since. The humiliation, the fever, the defiance, the survival. She carried it back to the barrack. Marta stirred as the door creaked open. "Lotta?" she whispered. "What are you doing?" Lotta didn't answer. She set a basin of water beside her bunk and began washing the mud away, slowly, methodically. Each stroke of the cloth was a confession, a memory, a refusal to forget. When the water turned black, she didn't stop. She kept rinsing until only the faint outlines of the stains remained. Then she hung the dress beside the new gray one, side by side. The contrast was striking. One spotless and plain, the other ragged and scarred. But Lotta couldn't throw the old one away. Reports from post-war Germany mention that the average civilian was allotted less than 400 grams of fabric per year in 1945. For Lotte, that number wasn't an economic fact. It was the measure of how much memory could fit into cloth. When Daniels saw it during her next inspection, she didn't say a word. She just looked at the two dresses swaying in the draft and nodded once, like she understood something unspoken. That night, Lotte whispered to Marta, "The mud carries memory. I can't wash it away." By morning, every woman in the barrack would hang her old dress beside the new. By morning, the barrack looked transformed. Dozens of dresses, new and old, hung side by side on ropes stretched between bunks, gray next to color, torn beside whole. The sight was strangely beautiful, even in the dim light. The air still smelled of disinfectant and smoke, but for once it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a quiet museum of survival. Lieutenant Daniels stood in the doorway, her gloved hands clasped. The women had done this themselves. No orders, no speeches, just an unspoken agreement. They refused to let the past be buried in mud. Every stain on those old dresses told a story the war had tried to erase. Lotte touched the faded fabric gently. It was still damp, still rough against her fingers. "We'll take them home," she said softly. Marta nodded. If home still exists. No one laughed. No one cried. They just kept folding, smoothing, saving what little they had. Outside, snow fell in thin sheets. The guards walked slower these days, quieter. Something had shifted inside the fences. Not a truce, but a mutual awareness. Even the Americans began to understand that victory didn't mean triumph. It meant responsibility. Official records later noted that by 1946, most female POWs in Western Allied custody were repatriated. Many returned to ruins, carrying with them whatever scraps of clothing they owned. Some of those very dresses, mud-stained, patched, and threadbare, still survive in small German museums today. They aren't displayed as relics of defeat, but as proof of endurance. In her final camp log before transfer, Lieutenant Daniels wrote a single line. "They remind me that survival isn't just breathing, it's remembering." As the women prepared for departure weeks later, Lotte packed both dresses together, the gray one folded neatly, the blue one still smelling faintly of soil. She didn't know if she'd ever wear them again, but she couldn't leave either behind. At roll call, when the trucks arrived, the prisoners stood ready. The mud under their boots had frozen solid overnight, leaving no footprints. "They threw our only dresses into the mud," Lotte whispered, as she climbed aboard. "But not our souls." The engine roared, smoke curling into the pale sky, and the camp slowly disappeared behind them, leaving only the wind and the faint flutter of drying cloth.